My name is Helen Carter. I am 55 years old. For more than 3 decades, I worked as a hospital nurse. I spent my life caring for strangers, tending to wounds, holding hands in the quiet of the night when families could not be there. Yet when it came to my own family, I never imagined that the deepest wound would be given by my son. My son sent me a bottle of whiskey for my 68th birthday. I did not know it was meant as a test. I do not even drink, but the weight of the bottle in my hands felt strange, almost mocking. I kept it on the counter unopened, as if it might answer the questions that had begun to gnaw at me. That same week, I picked up the phone to ask Henry, my only son, about his wedding date. I wanted to mark the day in my calendar to prepare the pale pink dress I had bought with money set aside from my modest pension. I imagined sitting quietly at the back of the church, watching him start a new life, carrying the love of both his late father and me. But it was not Henry who answered the call. It was Lydia, his fiancée. Her voice was coated with a sweetness that felt artificial, and before I could say more than hello, she smirked coldly into the receiver. I was sitting by the window, holding my phone in one hand and my blue porcelain cup in the other. The afternoon sun spilled across the table. For a moment, life felt steady. Then Lydia smirked and said, "We got married yesterday. Only special people." The cup slipped, tea splashed onto my wrist, and my soul cracked like porcelain. Only special people were invited. Only special people. The words hit me harder than any fall I had seen in the hospital wards. My hand trembled. The ceramic cup I was holding shook so hard I feared it would break. That cup, blue and chipped on one side, was the last gift from my late husband. I had kept it for 20 years as a reminder of the life we had built, of mornings filled with laughter and scrambled eggs. Now, in a single sentence, that fragile piece of my past felt as though it had been stolen. I stood in the silence of my kitchen staring at the calendar, where I had circled dates in hope. The pale pink dress hung in my closet, useless. The envelope with $1,000 saved as a wedding gift sat unopened on the dresser. My chest ached not from illness, but from a truth too heavy to bear. My son had started a new chapter, and I was not even considered part of the story. A week later, my phone rang again. This time it was Lydia. The same woman who had dismissed me with that cruel smile now sounded breathless, almost desperate. "Helen, the rent is overdue. Did you transfer it? The landlord says we will be out by Friday if we do not pay." For a moment I said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a tight wire ready to snap. In that silence, my mind replayed every trip I had made to the bank, every late-night meal of rice and beans I had eaten, so that Henry and Lydia could have comfort. Over 3 years, I had transferred more than $33,000 from my savings money meant to protect my own old age. I had carried their burdens quietly, believing love would come back in return. I inhaled slowly, steadying my voice. My heart was racing, but my words came out calm, sharper than any scalpel I had held. "I warned you before, my help isn't endless. I only help special people." On the other end, there was no sound, not even breathing. The silence was so deep, I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. For the first time, it was not me trembling. It was her. I set the phone down and wrapped my hands around the chipped blue cup. For years it had witnessed my sacrifices, my silent prayers, my foolish hope. Now it would witness something new, the moment I finally learned that silence, when chosen with strength, can be louder than any cry for help. That night I sat by the window with the whiskey bottle still unopened on the counter. I realized it had never been a gift. It had been a measure of how much I would endure, but I was done being tested. My son might have walked into a marriage without me, but I was walking into a truth of my own love does not need to be purchased, and respect cannot be begged. And in the quiet of that night, I understood something I should have learned long ago. Silence, when born of dignity, is not weakness. It is freedom. When I look back over the years, I sometimes wonder how I managed to carry so much on my shoulders without collapsing. My name is Helen Carter, and I became a widow when I was only 38. My husband Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving me with a 12-year-old boy who had just lost his father. I was working double shifts at the hospital back then, running between the emergency room and the long-term care unit. And yet, when I came home, I still had to be both mother and father to Henry. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after the funeral, staring at the chipped blue ceramic cup Robert had left behind, the one he used every single morning for his coffee. I held it in my hands and whispered to myself, "You have no choice now, Helen. You have to be strong. For him." That cup became my anchor, my reminder that even though Robert was gone, his presence was still with me. It stayed beside me through every night of exhaustion and every morning of renewed duty. Raising Henry on my own was not easy. He was bright, but he struggled with discipline. I made sure he had everything he needed: textbooks, shoes, new uniforms for school. I never let him feel the emptiness of poverty, even though many nights I ate leftovers from the hospital cafeteria, so that he could have a warm meal at home. When his classmates went on field trips, I made sure he went too, even if it meant pawning my wedding ring once to cover the cost. I told myself one day he will see how much I gave up, and he will be proud of me. That hope was the only thing that kept me going. Through high school, Henry needed more than I could give, but I gave anyway. I worked nights so that I could attend his basketball games sitting on the bleachers, with my nurse's scrubs still on the smell of disinfectant clinging to me. I cheered louder than anyone else, even though I was often the only parent there. When he wanted to apply to college out of state, I did not hesitate, even though tuition seemed impossible. I took out a loan against the house Robert had left us. The chipped blue cup sat on the desk as I signed the papers, as if Robert himself was watching over me, reminding me that this was all for our boy. I paid for Henry's dorm room, his meal plans, and when he came home with stories of friends whose parents had bought them cars, I scraped enough together for a used sedan. It was not much, but it was freedom for him. I remember the pride in his eyes the day I handed him the keys. He hugged me quickly, distracted, already thinking about showing his friends. I told myself not to mind. Boys at that age are careless with gratitude, I thought. One day he will remember who stood by him. But as years passed, the line between helping and enabling began to blur. Henry graduated, yet the request did not stop. Rent money, job troubles, bills piling up, every call seemed to end with me transferring money. I did it without hesitation because in my mind, I was still protecting my child. "This is what mothers do," I whispered, over the blue cup each morning. "We keep giving until our children can stand tall." I never remarried. I told myself that my devotion to Henry was enough, that my life was full, because his future was secure. At work, colleagues told me I should think about myself, maybe travel, maybe take up hobbies. But I dismissed them. My purpose was Henry. Everything else could wait. I remember the day he moved in with Lydia. He brought her over one Sunday afternoon. She was polite, charming, even with a smile that seemed to cover every inch of her face. She noticed the blue cup on the table and laughed lightly. "That's cute." "Vintage," I smiled back though. Inside, I felt a sting. That cup was not decoration. It was history. It was my lifeline. But I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence often kept the peace. In those early months, I tried to welcome her. I bought them furniture for their small apartment, paid the deposit when the landlord demanded extra. When they said money was tight, I filled their fridge. When Lydia needed help with medical bills, I pulled from my savings. I justified every check, every wire transfer. They are young, I told myself. Starting a life is hard. Robert would want me to help. Still, each time I opened my bank account, the numbers dwindled, and each time I held that blue cup, I felt the weight of Robert's absence more heavily. Am I doing this right, I would ask in the silence of my kitchen? Or am I only delaying the moment when Henry must face the world as an adult? Henry rarely visited without Lydia. And when he did, our conversations felt rushed, as though he had somewhere more important to be. The boy who once clung to my hand when storms shook the windows was now a man who barely noticed the wrinkles deepening on my face. Yet I convinced myself that love was still there, hidden beneath the surface. I thought, if I keep sacrificing, one day, happiness will bloom. One day he will see. I realize now that what I mistook for devotion was fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of being unneeded, fear of living a life without purpose. I thought that as long as I kept giving, I would remain necessary, that Henry would never forget me. But generosity without boundaries becomes chains, and I had forged my own. That chipped blue cup was beside me through every sacrifice, every signature on every check. Every night I sat alone with my ledger of expenses. It reminded me of Robert's steady presence, of the life we built together, of the promise that love was worth everything. Yet the irony was cruel. In trying to honor that love, I had drained the well until there was almost nothing left for myself. I thought if I just sacrificed enough, happiness would arrive on its own. That is what I whispered to myself in the quiet of my room, holding the cup as though it could answer me. But happiness is not a reward for suffering. It does not appear simply because you have endured enough pain. That truth was waiting for me, sharp and merciless, in the days ahead. The first cracks in the picture I had painted of our family began so quietly that at first I convinced myself they were nothing. A small request here, a small favor there. Every parent helps their children, I told myself, especially when they are just starting out. But over time, those little cracks widened into deep lines, and soon the entire foundation of what I thought was love began to tremble. I remember the first time Henry called me after moving in with Lydia. He spoke quickly, almost embarrassed, and said, "Mom, the landlord is asking for an extra deposit. Lydia and I didn't plan for it. Could you help us out?" His voice carried a hint of shame, but it was overshadowed by expectation. Without hesitation, I reached into my savings and wrote the check. I told myself it was temporary, that he just needed a little help to get on his feet. The second request came only weeks later. Lydia's voice on the phone was light, cheerful, even affectionate. "Helen, you've always been such a lifesaver. The fridge broke down, and we've been eating takeout for days. It's so expensive. Do you think you could lend us something to get a new one?" I heard Henry in the background, silent. When I asked to speak to him, Lydia laughed it off, saying he was busy with a project. I wired the money that same afternoon, convincing myself that it was just another one-time emergency. But the emergencies kept multiplying. Rent due earlier than expected, car trouble that needed immediate repair, doctor visits, and job interviews that required just a little boost. Each time I found myself sitting at my kitchen table, ledger open, recording every amount down to the last dollar. I wanted to believe that by keeping track I was in control. Yet with every entry, I felt myself sinking further into a pattern I could not escape. Within 3 years, the numbers told a story my heart refused to accept. $18,000 for rent, over $7,000 for groceries and supplies, thousands more for gifts and small crises. The total crept past $30,000. $30,000 money that should have secured my retirement, that should have been used to fix the roof or plan a trip I had always dreamed of. Instead, it had evaporated into the comfort of 2 adults, fully capable of providing for themselves. The chipped blue cup was always there on the table when I made these calculations. Its crack along the rim reminded me of Robert's absence and the promise I had made to be both parents. I ran my fingers along that crack more than once, thinking, if Robert were here, would he say I was doing right, or would he shake his head at the way I was draining myself dry? I began to notice Henry's silence more than Lydia's words. When I asked him gently if he was looking for better work, his answers were vague. "Yeah, Mom, I'm trying. Things are just tough right now." When I pressed further, he would change the subject or pass the phone to Lydia. She always had the sweeter voice, the carefully chosen words that wrapped their requests in flattery. "You're such a blessing, Helen. We don't know what we'd do without you." Those words felt warm at first, but later they began to sting. Inside, a question kept echoing. How long is it a mother's duty to carry a grown man, I asked myself, in the quiet moments after hanging up the phone. Am I helping him, or am I teaching him that he never has to stand alone? I thought about the patients I had cared for at the hospital, people who clung to life with dignity, even when everything else was stripped away. They fought for their independence, and here I was giving away Henry's independence piece by piece in the name of love. Still, when the calls came, I answered. When the texts lit up my phone, I read them immediately. I could not stand the thought of him struggling, even if it meant I struggled instead. I told myself this is what mothers do. We give, we endure. One day he will look back and realize how much I sacrificed. But as time passed, I began to recognize the pattern. Henry no longer asked directly. It was always Lydia's voice, smooth and persuasive. When I questioned her, she would laugh softly. "You know how proud Henry is, Helen. He doesn't want to burden you, but I know you want to help. You're family, and family takes care of each other." Her words twisted the truth. Yes, family takes care of each other, but care is not supposed to be one-sided. Care is not supposed to drain one life so another can thrive in comfort. I knew this, yet I stayed quiet, trapped in the web of my own devotion. The ledger became my confession book. Late at night, I would sit with the lamp glowing softly, writing down the amounts with trembling hands. Each line felt like a wound, and yet I kept adding more. Sometimes I would place the blue cup beside the ledger as though Robert could see what I was doing. "I hope I'm not failing him," I whispered. "I hope he won't resent me for always stepping in." The truth was harder to face. Henry had already begun to resent my questions. Whenever I asked why he had not found steadier work, or why Lydia did not contribute more, he would sigh heavily as though I were nagging him. "Mom, you don't understand how hard it is out there. Things aren't the way they used to be." Then he would go silent, leaving me with nothing but my own guilt. And yet Lydia always knew how to soften the edges. "Helen, you're amazing. Honestly, you're the reason we're still afloat. You have such a kind heart." Her compliments felt rehearsed, as though she had learned exactly which buttons to press. For a while, they worked. I believed her words even as my account balance slipped lower and lower. Looking back, I see now that the cracks had already spread through everything I held dear. My trust, my savings, my sense of purpose, they were all wearing thin. But in that moment, I was blind. I told myself that love required sacrifice, and I was willing to give until there was nothing left. The moral conflict lived inside me like a shadow. I was the woman who held strangers' hands in their final hours, reminding them that dignity mattered. Yet with my own son, I surrendered my dignity, piece by piece, mistaking it for love. Each time I opened my wallet, I thought I was buying closeness. In reality, I was only purchasing distance. The cracks had formed, but I did not yet know they would soon shatter everything I had built. The day I found out about my son's wedding was not through an invitation, not through a phone call, not even through a hurried message. I discovered it the way strangers do, through a flicker of light on a computer screen, scrolling through photographs that were never meant for me. It was late evening. I had finished a long shift at the hospital, my legs aching from hours on the ward, and I made myself a cup of tea in the chipped blue ceramic cup. I sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a dim yellow glow, and opened my laptop. It was habit more than curiosity. I had joined social media years ago only to keep up with Henry, to watch his life unfold in pictures, since his words came less and less. The first image that appeared stopped my breath. There was Henry standing in a suit, his arm around Lydia in a white dress that shimmered under the lights. Her smile stretched wide, victorious. Around them, glasses raised, laughter frozen in time by the camera's flash. Her parents stood proudly beside her, her siblings toasted with champagne. Behind them, tables glowed with flowers and candles. I stared at the screen, unable to move. Each picture that followed was sharper than a knife. Lydia tossing her bouquet, Henry leaning in for a kiss, friends dancing, relatives clapping. And in every frame, one truth burned: I was not there. In the corner of my closet upstairs hung the pale pink dress I had bought months before, still wrapped in clear plastic. Next to it sat the white shoes never worn, and the sealed envelope holding $1,000 in cash, carefully saved from my pension as their wedding gift. I had imagined the moment I would press that envelope into Henry's hands, the moment our eyes would meet and he would see not just a mother, but the woman who had carried him through storms alone. Now all of it, dress shoes gift, lay buried in silence, stripped of meaning. I closed the laptop, but the images did not leave me. They danced behind my eyelids, each one louder than the last. My chest felt hollow, as though someone had scooped out everything inside and left only air. The chipped blue cup trembled in my hands, tea sloshing against its cracked rim. I whispered into the empty room, "Not special enough, not even for one day." The next morning, the world went on as if nothing had happened. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, buses rumbled past, children laughed on their way to school. I dressed for another shift, pinned my badge, tied my shoes, and moved through the motions of care. But inside, I was carrying a wound no one could see. On my way home that evening, I stopped by the small grocery store around the corner. As I placed milk and bread in my basket, I heard a familiar voice. It was Mrs. Coleman, my neighbor, a retired teacher with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She had always been kind, the sort of woman who notices everything but speaks with gentleness. She smiled at me and said, "Helen, I saw pictures on Facebook. Such a beautiful wedding. Why didn't I see you there?" Her words landed heavier than the bags in my hands. For a second, I felt dizzy, as though the store aisles had tilted. My throat tightened, but I forced a small smile, the kind nurses learn to give when holding back their own tears. Oh, I manage my voice too light to be true. Sometimes families keep things simple. Mrs. Coleman tilted her head, puzzled. Simple. Well, I thought you'd be front and center after everything you've done for Henry, she paused, then touched my arm gently. I'm sure it was just an oversight. I nodded, still smiling, though the edges of my lips trembled. Yes, perhaps. But as I walked back home, groceries cutting into my fingers, I replayed her words. Front and center. Oversight. They twisted inside me. There was no oversight. There was intention. Lydia's smirk on the phone came back to me, sharp and cold. Only special people were invited. At home, I placed the groceries on the counter and opened the closet door once more. The pale pink dress hung there, quietly mocking me with its unused beauty. I ran my hand over the fabric, soft under my fingers, and felt the weight of years pressing down. The shoes gleamed untouched. The envelope lay where I had hidden it, thick with bills that would never cross into Henry's hands. I sat on the edge of my bed with the dress draped across my lap. Tears welled, but they did not fall. I had cried enough in my life when Robert died, when I faced raising Henry alone, when bills piled high. This time the tears hardened inside me, crystallizing into something else: recognition. Recognition that my sacrifices had not been honored, that my love had been treated like currency, and that my presence had been dismissed as unnecessary. Later that night, Mrs. Coleman knocked on my door with a small plate of cookies. She handed them to me with a warm smile and said softly, "You looked sad earlier. If you ever need to talk, I'm right next door." Her kindness pierced me in a way the wedding pictures had not. She saw me not as an inconvenience, not as a wallet, but as a neighbor, a person. I thanked her, forcing another smile, though this time less strained. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table, with the plate untouched, staring again at the chipped blue cup. It struck me then that silence had become my language. I had smiled when I wanted to scream. I had nodded when I wanted to demand answers. And yet, despite everything, I could not stop loving my son. That was the cruelest truth of all. I whispered into the night. I thought, if I just gave enough, if I just sacrificed enough, one day I would be invited to the happiness I helped build. But the invitation never came, and so I sat with the blue cup in one hand and the pale pink dress hanging lifeless in the closet, realizing that sometimes the deepest betrayal is not shouted in anger. Sometimes it arrives dressed in white lace, celebrated with champagne, and broadcast to the world, while a mother sits at home unseen. After the wedding revelation, something inside me cracked open. It was as if every sacrifice I had made was suddenly illuminated under a harsh light, each one laid bare for me to count, to measure, to finally face. I sat at the kitchen table with my ledger open, the chipped blue cup beside me, and for the first time in years, I forced myself to write the truth without excuses. Rent alone had drained me. $500 a month, 36 months straight. $18,000 gone wired faithfully without fail. Next, groceries and household supplies, $200 a month, another $7,200. Furniture, medical emergencies, gifts for birthdays and holidays, a car loan. I had never been repaid the air conditioner repair, even the rings they wore at their wedding. The numbers multiplied like shadows, until they formed one single suffocating figure. $33,400. I whispered the number aloud, as though hearing it would make it more real. 33,400. My voice trembled. That was more than my yearly salary when I first started at the hospital. That was more than Robert had left me in his savings. That was the sum of my widowhood poured into the comfort of two people who could not even spare me a seat at their table on the most important day of their lives. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the cracked rim of the cup Robert had used every morning. Tears blurred my vision, but I did not wipe them away. They fell silently, soaking into the ledger, smudging the careful columns of ink. The room was quiet except for the sound of my own breathing, uneven, shallow. In that silence, a sentence rose up from the depths of me, uninvited but undeniable. I am not a mother anymore. I am just an ATM with feelings. The words were bitter, but they fit. They fit too well. I had mistaken transactions for love wires, for closeness, checks for respect. And now the truth mocked me in black and white. That night stretched longer than any night I could remember. I sat in the dark kitchen, the clock ticking softly, the blue cup in my hands. I ran my fingers over its chipped edge, remembering Robert's steady presence, his laughter the mornings we used to share before work. I wondered what he would think if he saw me now, tired, depleted, hollowed out by a son who had learned to take without giving. At some point, exhaustion pulled me into sleep at the table. I woke with stiff limbs and swollen eyes, the dawn light spilling through the curtains. My phone buzzed sharp and jarring, pulling me fully awake. The name on the screen was Lydia. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out, but habit drew my thumb across the screen. Her voice came fast-coded in urgency. "Helen, thank God you picked up. The rent is overdue. The landlord says if we don't pay by tomorrow, we'll be out." "Did you forget the transfer?" I stared at the cup in my hand. Steam from the fresh tea curling into the air. My tears from the night before had dried, leaving behind something sharper, colder. The silence stretched between us as I inhaled slowly, deliberately. Lydia's breathing on the other end grew uneven, as if she could sense the shift. And then I spoke my words, calm, almost gentle, but edged with finality. "Only special people." The line went quiet. I could almost hear her heart skip, almost hear the panic rising in her throat. She tried to recover. "Helen, what do you mean? You know you've always said we're family, we're special to you." But this time her words slid off me like rain against glass. My hands were steady, my voice did not waver. "Special people, Lydia. And you made it very clear last week that I wasn't one of them." The silence that followed was deeper than anything I had ever heard from her. For years she had filled every pause with charm, with manipulation, with sweetness, sharpened into demand. Now she had nothing. I ended the call before she could gather her words. I set the phone down next to the ledger, the final figure still glaring up at me. $33,400. A lifetime of sacrifice stripped of meaning in the face of their cruelty. But as I sat there, an unfamiliar strength stirred inside me. For the first time in years, I had not bent. I had not explained, excused, or offered. I had chosen silence as my shield and truth as my weapon. And in that choice, I felt something I had not felt in a long time: freedom. The blue cup rested warm in my hands, no longer trembling. I raised it to my lips, sipped the tea slowly, and let the quiet of the morning settle into my bones. They had called me for money as always, but this time the answer had been no. And though the weight of betrayal still pressed heavy against my chest beneath it all, a spark of dignity glowed. It was small, fragile, but it was mine. I knew then that the breaking point had arrived. And I also knew that from this moment on, the cracks would no longer belong to me. They would belong to Henry and Lydia, and they would have to live with the silence that followed. The morning after I told Lydia, "Only special people," I felt something in me shift. The weight I had carried for years, guilt, obligation, fear, was still there, but lighter somehow, like I had finally loosened a chain around my own neck. I dressed slowly, buttoning my cardigan with deliberate care, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were swollen from the tears of the night before, but behind the exhaustion there was a clarity I had not seen in years. I made myself a cup of tea in Robert's blue ceramic mug, letting the steam curl into the air. I held it close, the heat warming my palms, and whispered, "I have to stop this, Robert. I have to stop letting them take." The cup had been my anchor for so long, but now it felt like a witness to my suffering, but also to the possibility of change. After breakfast, I gathered my checkbook, my account statements, and the worn leather wallet Robert had given me on our 10th anniversary. I slipped them into my handbag and drove to the bank. My heart pounded as I parked outside the brick building I had entered hundreds of times before, always with the same purpose: to take money out for Henry and Lydia. This time my steps felt heavier but steadier. Inside, the air was cool and familiar. The sound of printers whirring, the quiet murmur of customers, the faint scent of floor polish. It was the backdrop of my years of sacrifice. Behind the glass doors of his office, I saw Mr. Klein, the branch manager. He had known me for more than a decade, always polite, always efficient. He looked up, saw me, and immediately waved me in with a warm smile. "Mrs. Carter," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Good to see you. How are you doing?" I sat down, slowly placing my papers on his desk. "Mr. Klein, I need your help. I want to cancel all the automatic transfers I have set up to my son's account." His eyebrows lifted slightly, surprise flashing across his face. All of them? Yes, I said firmly. My voice was calm, though my hands trembled slightly in my lap. Every single one. I don't want another dollar leaving my account without my consent. For a moment he was silent, studying me. Then he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. Mrs. Carter, if I may say so, it's about time. I've watched you come in here month after month transferring large sums. I never judged, of course it's not my place, but I always wondered if anyone was taking care of you the way you've been taking care of them. His words pierced me more deeply than I expected. My throat tightened, but I managed to nod. No one takes care of me, Mr. Klein. Not anymore. He gave me a sympathetic smile, softer this time. You've been more generous than most parents I've ever seen. But generosity without limits becomes exploitation. Please don't let anyone continue to take advantage of you. I felt my chest tighten with both pain and relief. To hear someone say aloud what I had been afraid to admit to myself, that I had been exploited, was like a blow and a balm at the same time. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. I think I already let it go too far. $33,000 too far. He nodded gravely and reached for the computer. Let's fix this today. I'll cancel the transfers and put a block in place, so no one but you can authorize new ones. And if you'd like, I can also add extra security measures to your account. Yes, I whispered. Please, I want my money to be mine again. As he typed, I sat quietly listening to the soft clicks of the keyboard. It felt like the sound of my chains being cut one by one. For years, I had let my love be measured in numbers. Now, with each keystroke, I was reclaiming it. When the paperwork was finished, Mr. Klein printed the confirmation and handed it to me. There, he said, it's done. From now on, you are the only one in control. I took the papers with trembling hands, pressing them against my chest. Thank you, Mr. Klein. You don't know what this means to me. He looked at me kindly. I think I do. You've carried others long enough. It's time to stand on your own 2 feet, Mrs. Carter. I left the bank lighter than I had entered. The sky outside seemed brighter, the air fresher. For the first time in years, I felt like I had made a decision for myself, not for Henry, not for Lydia, just for me. When I got home, I placed the paperwork neatly in a folder and set it beside the blue cup on the table. As if Robert himself were watching, I whispered, "It's done. No more." My phone buzzed almost immediately. Henry's name lit up the screen. I stared at it, the vibration rattling against the wood. One call, then another, then a third. I let them ring. For years I had picked up before the second ring, my heart racing, my voice eager to soothe. Now I watched the screen go dark, then light up again, then again. 10 calls, 15, 20. Each one unanswered. My silence, once a mark of fear, was now my shield. The phone finally stopped. The quiet filled the room like a hymn. I set the blue cup in front of me, ran my thumb over its crack, and breathed deeply. For years I thought my power came from giving. Now I realized it came from stopping. This was my first reversal, my first step back toward dignity. And though I knew Henry and Lydia would not accept it quietly, I also knew I would never go back. When I returned home from the bank that day, my arms felt lighter, as if I had laid down a burden I had carried for decades. I had in my handbag the papers Mr. Klein had given me, proof that the transfers were canceled, proof that my life was mine again. I thought I would come home to peace, to the quiet companionship of my chipped blue cup, and the relief of a hard choice finally made. But what I found instead was the deepest violation yet. 3 cars sat in front of my house when I pulled into the driveway. Henry's sedan, Lydia's compact car, and a third vehicle I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened, a sense of unease rising in my chest. I told myself maybe they had come to talk. Maybe Henry wanted to apologize. But as I stepped onto the porch, I saw movement through the front window, shadows shifting across my living room. My living room. I pushed the door open and froze. There they were, Henry, head in his hands on the couch, Lydia pacing back and forth like a restless cat, and a man I had never seen before in a gray suit sitting at my dining table, surrounded by my papers, my bank statements, my insurance files, even the deed to my house scattered across the wood as if they belonged to him. What is happening here? My voice came out louder than I expected, steadier than I felt. All 3 heads snapped toward me. For a moment, guilt flickered across Henry's face, but Lydia's expression hardened quickly, rearranging itself into faux concern. She hurried toward me, her voice dripping with sugary urgency. Helen, thank God you're here. We need to talk about your situation. My situation, I stepped fully into the room, shutting the door behind me. These are my private documents. Who gave you permission to go through them? The man in the suit stood smiling in a way that felt more like a threat than a greeting. He extended his hand. Mrs. Carter, I'm Mr. Fisher. I'm an attorney. Your children are worried about you. They asked me to advise on some matters, specifically your financial well-being. I ignored his hand and walked past him, gathering my papers from the table with shaking fingers that quickly steadied as anger replaced fear. You had no right to touch these. This is my home. These are my papers. Henry finally spoke, his tone patronizing, as if I were a child who needed scolding. Mom, we're worried about you. You've been acting strange lately. First you cut off the transfers without telling us. Then you won't answer our calls. We just want to make sure you're okay. I am okay, I said firmly, clearer than I've been in years. Lydia stepped forward, her voice soft but calculated. She reached for my hand, but I pulled it back before she could touch me. Helen, honey, you've been under a lot of stress. Losing Robert, working so much, being alone all these years, it can take a toll. Sometimes people your age start to get confused without even realizing it. We're just trying to protect you. Her words hit like a slap. Confused. People your age. The narrative was already in place, rehearsed. They weren't here to check on me. They were here to strip me of the very thing I had fought to preserve my independence. Mr. Fisher slid a folder across the table toward me. Mrs. Carter, this is a power of attorney form. If you sign, Henry and Lydia can help you manage your finances. It's just a precaution, of course, temporary until you're feeling more like yourself. For the first time in years, I did not tremble. I stood tall, clutching my papers to my chest, and looked each of them in the eye. You break into my house, read my papers, and still call me confused. Get out. These are my accounts. And I will not sign anything. All three of you need to leave. Now. Silence filled the room. Lydia blinked, stunned by the firmness in my tone. Henry shifted uncomfortably, unused to seeing me this way. Mr. Fisher, however, did not falter. His smile thinned into something colder. Mrs. Carter, he said smoothly, if you refuse to cooperate, your children have legal options. If your ability to manage your affairs is impaired, a judge can assign a guardian. It's a fairly straightforward process. And from what I've been told, there's plenty of evidence to raise concern. My heart pounded, but my voice stayed steady. Concern? You mean because I finally stopped letting you drain me dry? Because I decided my money belongs to me, not to fund your lifestyle? Lydia's mask slipped, then her tone sharp. We never treated you badly, Helen. We're family. Everything you have will be ours one day anyway. We're just trying to make the transition smoother. There it was, the naked truth spoken without shame. To them I was already gone. To them I was nothing but an inheritance in waiting. I pointed to the door, my hand no longer trembling. Get out, all of you. Out of my house. Henry rose from the couch, anger tightening his jaw. Mom, be reasonable. You can't just cut us off. We have bills. We have responsibilities. Those are your responsibilities, I said, my voice rising for the first time. Not mine. Mr. Fisher gathered his papers calmly, but his eyes stayed locked on me. This isn't over, Mrs. Carter. Your children are concerned, and they have every right to pursue guardianship if they believe you're not capable of making sound decisions. Guardianship. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. The threat was clear: if I would not hand over control, they would try to take it by force of law. I did not flinch. Tell whatever story you want, I said. But know this, I am not confused. I am not weak, and I will fight. Lydia's eyes narrowed, tears forming not of sorrow but of frustration. You can't do this to us, Helen. We need you. No, I replied, my voice like stone. You need my money, and that's over. They left with the heavy steps of people unused to being denied. Henry threw one last look at me, a mix of anger and something else, fear. Lydia kept her head high, but her lips pressed tight with rage. Mr. Fisher simply adjusted his tie and gave me a thin smile. As the door closed behind them, I stood in the quiet of my own living room, papers clutched to my chest. For the first time in years, my hands did not shake. For the first time in years, the silence felt like victory, but I also knew this was not the end. Their threat hung in the air, poisonous and real. They would not stop. They would come back armed with lies and legal jargon, determined to take what I had left. Still, as I set the blue cup back on the table, I whispered to myself, I am not afraid. For the first time, it was true. The morning after they stormed my living room, I woke with the echo of their threat still pressing down on me. Guardianship. The word clung to my skin like frost. I had spent decades working, saving, enduring, only to be told by my own blood that I was too confused to live freely. My body ached with the weight of it, but I knew one thing as clearly as the sun streaming through my curtains: I needed help. I drove across town to see Mr. Harris. He was the lawyer who had guided me through the paperwork. When Robert died, the one who had helped me secure the deed to this house. His office was a modest brick building on the corner of Maple and 3rd with ivy creeping along the side. I remembered sitting in that office years ago, signing documents with trembling hands while tears blurred my vision. He had been patient then, steady and kind. When I walked in this time, his secretary greeted me with a smile. And moments later, he appeared, glasses low on his nose, hair grayer than I remembered, but posture as upright as ever. Helen Carter, he said warmly, shaking my hand. It's been too long. What brings you in? I sat down across from him, clutching the folder I had stuffed with ledgers and bank slips. My voice shook as I began, but once the words started, they tumbled out in a rush. I told him about Henry and Lydia, about the $33,400 that had left my account over the past 3 years. The wedding I wasn't invited to, the intrusion in my living room, the power of attorney papers shoved across my table, and Mr. Fisher's veiled threats. When I finished, the room felt heavy with silence. Mr. Harris leaned back, hands steepled, his face grave. Helen, he said slowly, what you're describing has a name. It's elder financial abuse. They've crossed legal boundaries as well as moral ones, entering your home without consent, pressuring you to sign over your finances, threatening guardianship. That's more than manipulation. That's exploitation. The word stung. Abuse. I had avoided calling it that, preferring words like sacrifice, obligation, even love. But as he spoke, I realized those words had been lies I told myself. Abuse was the truth. I lowered my eyes to the folder in my lap. I kept notes, I whispered. Every transfer, every bill, every so-called emergency. I thought it made me responsible, but now it feels like I was recording my own undoing. On the contrary, Mr. Harris said firmly, those records may save you. Documentation is our greatest ally. I want you to organize every receipt, every line in your ledger. Keep a journal starting today. Record each phone call, every text, every visit. If they try to pursue guardianship, we'll fight it with evidence of your competence and their coercion. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was direction. A plan. I wasn't wandering blind anymore. I had a map. I'll do it, I said, straightening in my chair. Every detail, every dollar. He nodded. Good. And Helen, don't let them corner you again. If they show up at your home, call me. Better yet, call the police. Your safety comes first. I left his office with the folder clutched against my chest like a shield. The sun outside seemed sharper, the air cooler, as if the world itself knew I had taken a step forward. When I pulled into my driveway, Mrs. Coleman was standing on her porch. She was a widow like me, silver-haired and spry, always tending to her roses. She waved me over. I've been worried about you, she said softly. I heard raised voices the other night. Is everything all right? I hesitated. Then crossed the lawn to her porch. Her eyes were kind, patient, and something in me broke open. No, I admitted. Henry and Lydia came with a lawyer. They said I was confused, that I needed to sign over my finances. They threatened to take me to court. Mrs. Coleman's face hardened, lines etching deeper around her mouth. She placed a hand on mine. Helen, I know that story too well. My own daughter tried the same. She bled me for years, rent, credit cards, endless emergencies. When I said no, she brought in a lawyer, claimed I was unfit to manage my own affairs. I fought. It was ugly, but I won. And I'll tell you this, the hardest part, it wasn't the court or the money. It was accepting that my own child saw me as a resource instead of a mother. Her words mirrored mine so closely. It was like looking into a reflection. I felt my throat tighten. How did you survive it? She smiled sadly. I remembered who I was before the demands. I leaned on friends, on neighbors, on people who saw me as more than a wallet. You're not alone, Helen. Don't let them make you think you are. Her grip tightened on my hand, and in that moment I felt the strength of solidarity, an invisible thread connecting women like us women who had given too much and been told it wasn't enough. That evening, I spread my papers across the dining table. My ledger lay open, the columns of figures stark in the lamplight. Bank receipts, check stubs, notes scrawled in the margins, all of it evidence. I began to sort them page by page, month by month, tracing the shape of my generosity until it revealed the outline of their greed. With each page I placed in order, I felt less like a victim and more like a witness to my own survival. The chipped blue cup sat at my elbow, warm with tea, watching like an old friend. For the first time, I didn't cry over the numbers. I documented them. I claimed them. They were no longer proof of my weakness, but proof of theirs. And as I worked, I thought of Mrs. Coleman's hand on mine, of Mr. Harris's steady voice. I was not alone. Not anymore. The days that followed felt like living under siege. Henry and Lydia did not take my silence as final. They filled my voicemail with pleading one moment and threats the next. Envelopes arrived in my mailbox, some handwritten, others stamped from law offices. I stopped opening them. Each one felt like a hook baited and waiting to reel me back into their trap. When I blocked their numbers, they found new ways to intrude. Strangers began knocking at my door, people I had never seen before, asking strange questions about my health. Are you eating enough? Do you remember what day it is? Their tone was polite, but their eyes flickered with suspicion. Rehearsed lines echoing someone else's story. It all came to a head one Thursday morning. A woman with a badge showed up at my door. Her suit was neat, her expression professional. Mrs. Carter, she said, I'm a social worker from the Office of Senior Services. We've received reports that you may be struggling to care for yourself. May I come in? The words made my stomach drop. Reports. I didn't need to ask who had filed them. I hesitated for a beat, then nodded. Refusal would only make me appear defensive. I invited her into the living room, offering her a seat at the table where I had spent nights cataloging every dollar given away. The chipped blue cup rested there, filled with tea. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Carter, she said, pulling a form from her folder. We've been told you've become forgetful, that you've stopped paying important bills, that you may be vulnerable to undue influence. We need to assess your situation. I let her words sink in, felt the insult sting beneath my ribs, then answered calmly. Before we go further, I'd like my attorney to be present. I've been advised never to sign or answer official questions alone. Her brows furrowed slightly, as though she wasn't used to being challenged. This isn't an interrogation, Mrs. Carter. It's just a wellness check. If you have nothing to hide, it should not be a problem, I interrupted softly. And that's exactly why I want everything done properly. Mr. Harris will be here shortly. I called him, my voice steady, and 20 minutes later he walked through the door, briefcase in hand. His presence filled the room with calm authority. He shook the social worker's hand and sat beside me, laying a thick folder on the table. Please continue, he said smoothly. The woman shifted in her seat, clearly caught off guard. She asked me a series of questions: my age, my medications, how I managed my finances. Each time I answered clearly, sometimes with documents in hand. Utility bills paid on time, tax returns, filed receipts in neat order. When she asked about my health, I told her about my walks around the neighborhood, the meals I cooked, the church group I occasionally attended. Her pen slowed. The skepticism in her eyes softened, though not fully gone. Mrs. Carter, she said, you seem more competent than the report suggested. But why would your family claim otherwise? Mr. Harris opened the folder and slid a packet of papers across the table. Perhaps this will explain. Here are records of $33,400 Helen has transferred to her son and daughter-in-law over the past 3 years. Rent, utilities, furniture, personal expenses. Every dollar documented. And here he tapped the pages, the recent attempt to have her sign over a power of attorney. This is not concern. This is financial dependency dressed up as guardianship. The social worker flipped through the pages, her lips tightening. She looked up at me again, and this time her expression held something closer to sympathy. I see, she murmured. She closed her folder slowly. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Carter. From what I've observed today, you are in full possession of your faculties. I will make note of that in my report. When she left, the air in my house seemed lighter. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Harris gathered the papers back into his briefcase, giving me a small nod. You did well, he said. But as I set the blue cup back on the table, I knew this wasn't over. Their campaign against me had only escalated, and if they had stooped to bringing in social services, the next step would be worse. Still, for the first time, I felt I wasn't facing it alone. The days after the social worker's visit were a blur of papers, signatures, and quiet determination. Mr. Harris and I met almost daily. His office became a second home, the polished oak table covered in neat stacks of bank receipts, ledgers, and correspondence. We organized everything, the $33,400 I had given away, broken down into rent, groceries, furniture, and endless emergencies. Every canceled check, every wire transfer, every scrap of proof was placed in order. "We'll need a medical evaluation too," Harris explained one afternoon, his tone steady but kind. "They will argue mental decline. We counter it with evidence, not emotion." So I went to see Dr. Moore, a psychiatrist Harris trusted. She asked me questions that spanned my entire life about my work as a nurse, my routines, my finances. She tested my memory with word lists, and puzzles asked me to do calculations, probed into whether I felt confused or disoriented. At the end, she smiled. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "your results are excellent. You are sharper than many people 20 years younger. I will provide a full report confirming your competence." The relief I felt wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, like a deep breath after surfacing from dark water. For so long I had feared the possibility that maybe they were right, that age had clouded me. But the test proved what I knew in my bones. My mind was intact. When I brought the report to Harris, he nodded, slipping it into the thick binder he had assembled. "With this, they'll have no case. Still, we prepare for every angle." At night, I sat at my dining table, spreading the documents out once more, tracing the numbers with my finger. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a map of my past mistakes and the strength I had found in finally saying no. Inside me, something shifted. Fear had ruled my life for too long. Fear of being alone, fear of losing Henry, fear of being seen as unworthy. But sitting there, surrounded by cold, hard proof, I realized I had already lost the version of Henry I once cherished. All I could do now was protect the part of myself that still remained. "I have been afraid my whole life," I whispered to the silence. "Now I have nothing left to lose." One evening, after another long day of preparation, I stood in the kitchen rinsing out my chipped blue cup. The water ran clear over porcelain worn by decades of use. I held it in both hands, letting the coolness seep into my palms, and then dried it carefully with a soft cloth. I placed it on the counter, not hurriedly, not carelessly, but with the reverence of someone laying down a sacred object. To anyone else, it was just a cup. To me, it was Robert's memory, my silent confidant through years of sacrifice. Washing it felt like tidying an altar in my own heart, not to grief anymore, but to resilience. I stepped back, looking at it sitting there in the fading light of evening. My reflection shone faintly on the glazed surface, lined and weary but steady. It struck me then, I wasn't just cleaning a cup. I was clearing space inside myself, preparing for what lay ahead. The trial was coming. They would throw lies, twisted words, and accusations. But I would stand with truth, with Harris by my side, with every page of documentation, with the calm certainty of someone who no longer bowed to fear. That night, I went to bed without dread, gnawing at my chest. The blue cup was in its place, gleaming quietly in the kitchen, a witness to the turning of a page. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, the kind of place where lives were rewritten with ink and signatures. I sat beside Mr. Harris at the long oak table, my folder of documents in front of me. The blue cup left safely at home on the counter, waiting for my return. Across the aisle, Henry and Lydia sat stiffly with their attorney, Mr. Fisher. Their eyes slid over me as though I were already defeated. The judge entered, a stern woman with steel-gray hair pulled back neatly. She glanced over the files before her. "We are here today to consider the petition for guardianship over Mrs. Helen Carter," she said. "Petitioners, you may proceed." Mr. Fisher rose, voice smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, my clients, Henry and Lydia Carter, come here today out of deep concern. Mrs. Carter has shown increasing confusion. She isolates herself, refuses communication, and has fallen under the influence of neighbors who have convinced her to act against her own family. She has cut off support for her son and daughter-in-law in ways that are irrational and cruel. We believe she requires guardianship for her own protection. I sat still, my hands folded neatly on the table. But inside I felt the sting of every word. Confused, irrational, manipulated. Words meant to erase a lifetime of competence. Henry was called to the stand first. He swore an oath, then began to speak, his tone carefully modulated. My mother has always been generous, but lately she's been different. She doesn't answer calls. She makes strange accusations. She listens to outsiders instead of her own family. Mr. Fisher pressed him with gentle questions, and Henry's answers painted me as erratic, unstable. Lydia followed her performance even more polished. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling. Mrs. Carter has always been like a second mother to me, but she's changed. She's paranoid. She accused us of using her when all we wanted was to love and support her. Their words floated in the courtroom like poison, but when Mr. Fisher called their witnesses, the poison began to thin. Mr. Davis, the neighbor across the street, testified that he saw strange visitors at my house and that I yelled in the yard. Under cross-examination, Harris asked, "Did you ever speak with Mrs. Carter directly about these observations?" Mr. Davis admitted he had not. His words suddenly seemed flimsy, a story built on shadows. Then came the pharmacist, Mr. Green. He claimed I mismanaged my medications. But when Harris presented the statement he had later signed, clarifying he had been misled by Lydia, the courtroom shifted. Mr. Green stammered, red-faced, admitting he had never seen me mishandle anything. One by one their witnesses unraveled. Their stories overlapped awkwardly, contradictions surfacing like cracks in weak plaster. Finally, it was my turn. I rose slowly, every step deliberate, and stood at the witness stand. My palms pressed against the smooth wood, steady as I faced the judge. Mrs. Carter, Harris began. "Would you tell the court in your own words why you chose to stop financial support?" I drew in a breath. My voice was calm, not trembling, because I realized I was no longer seen as a mother, but as an ATM with feelings. For 3 years, I paid their rent $500 a month, 36 months totaling $18,000. I paid for food, furniture, emergencies, another $15,400. Altogether, $33,400 left my account. I kept notes, every check, every transfer. I may not have been special enough to be at their wedding, but I am clear enough to stand here today and tell you exactly where every dollar went. The words settled into the room with the weight of stone. Even the judge looked up sharply at my repeated line. The echo of the insult they had thrown at me turned now into my shield. Harris guided me gently. "And do you believe you are competent to manage your own affairs?" I lifted my chin. "I know I am. I live alone. I drive myself. I pay my bills on time. I seek medical care when I need it. My mind is my own, and no one has the right to strip me of it." Silence followed, heavier than any outburst. I sat back down, my heart steady, as though years of trembling had burned out of me at last. The judge closed her file. "I have heard enough for today. This court will review all evidence before rendering a decision. But let me say this, Mrs. Carter. Your testimony was both lucid and precise." I felt my hands relax in my lap. For the first time, I believed that my voice, steady, measured, unbroken, might be stronger than all their lies combined. The judge returned after a long recess, her robe flowing as she stepped up to the bench. The entire courtroom hushed. The shuffle of papers silenced the air so tight it seemed to crackle. I sat with my hands folded, the blue veins across my skin standing out against the polished wood of the table. Harris gave me a small nod, steady, reassuring, but I felt the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. Judge Miller cleared her throat. "After reviewing all testimonies, witness statements, and medical evaluations, this court finds insufficient evidence to grant the petition for guardianship over Mrs. Helen Carter." The words rang like church bells inside me. She continued, her voice firm. "The evidence shows Mrs. Carter is in full possession of her mental faculties. Her financial decisions, whether pleasing to her family or not, are rational, consistent, and within her rights. The request for guardianship is hereby denied." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The tide I had fought for months had finally turned. I turned my head slightly. Henry sat slumped in his chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked smaller than I remembered, no longer the towering figure of my boy-turned man, but a shadow of someone who had gambled too much and lost. Lydia, by contrast, glared at me with a venom that could have cut glass. Her fingers dug into Henry's arm, her jaw tight, but her power was gone. They had brought everything they had, tears, lies, accusations, and still the truth had prevailed. I did not gloat. I did not cry. I simply inhaled deeply, letting the sound of the judge's ruling settle into my bones like a long-awaited balm. The judge struck her gavel once. This case is closed. I rose from my seat slowly, deliberately. My legs were steady beneath me, not the trembling limbs of a frightened woman, but the rooted strength of someone who had endured and stood tall. Harris gathered the binder of documents, tucking it carefully into his briefcase. "You did it, Helen," he whispered. "No," I said softly, "we did it." As I walked toward the double doors at the back of the courtroom, I didn't look at Henry again. I didn't need to. There was nothing left to salvage, no apology that could rewrite the betrayal. My silence was my answer, my boundary drawn in stone. The doors opened, spilling sunlight into the dim hallway. I stepped out, the air cool and fresh against my face. Each breath felt lighter, freer, as if I had been unshackled. For months I had lived under the threat of being erased, reduced to a confused old woman in the eyes of the law. Now, with one ruling, my dignity had been restored. And then, just beyond the steps of the courthouse, I saw her. Mrs. Coleman stood waiting, her cardigan pulled close, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. She smiled when she saw me, her eyes crinkling with warmth. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I needed someone there, someone who believed me, who knew the shape of this pain. My throat tightened. She walked forward, reaching out her hand. When her fingers closed around mine, I felt strength flow between us, steady and sure. "You're not alone, Helen," she said quietly. "We still have family. It just isn't always the kind we're born with." Tears welled hot and sharp, but they didn't fall from grief. They came from relief, from the strange joy of being understood. I squeezed her hand back. "Yes," I whispered. "We still have family." Together we walked down the courthouse steps, the autumn sun warming our backs. Behind me, Henry and Lydia's voices rose in argument, sharp and angry, but I didn't turn around. That chapter was finished. I had walked into the courthouse as someone accused, diminished, nearly stripped of her independence. I walked out as myself again, Helen Carter, 71 years old, whole, unbroken, and free. The first thing I did after the verdict was change the locks. The locksmith worked quickly, his tools clicking and turning as if sealing away the ghost that had walked through my door uninvited. New locks, new keys, a simple gesture, yet it felt like reclaiming my own home. The next day, Ethan, Mr. Harris's nephew, installed a security system with cameras. I watched him connect the wires and test the monitor. "Now you'll always know who's at your door," he said. When the screen lit up with the clear image of my porch, I felt a quiet relief settle over me. No more surprises, no more intrusions. At the bank, I opened a new account in my name, only far removed from Henry and Lydia. The manager smiled as she handed me the paperwork, and I felt a strange thrill. It was not the size of the balance that mattered, but the fact that it was mine, untouched, unclaimed, safe. For the first time in decades, my money began working for me. I booked a small tour through the countryside of Italy, a trip Robert and I had once dreamed of but never taken. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center, my brushes trailing color across paper, bringing to life flowers and landscapes I had long admired from afar. And I let myself meet people again. At the art class, I found laughter in the stories of other retirees, each of us starting anew in different ways. At the cafe, I joined conversations with strangers who became friends. Piece by piece, I stitched together a life that was mine alone, not defined by obligation or guilt. Through it all, the blue porcelain cup remained with me. I set it on my table each morning, pouring tea as sunlight slipped across the kitchen. Its chipped rim and faded glaze no longer felt like reminders of loss. They felt like proof of survival. One afternoon, after returning from a painting session, I placed the cup gently in front of me, steam rising. The house was quiet, no phone calls demanding money, no footsteps intruding on my peace. Just silence. I lifted the cup, took a slow sip, and whispered to myself, "This silence is freedom." I wasn't celebrating wealth or victory. I was celebrating the return of myself. The woman who had spent years in fear, tethered to the demands of others, had finally stepped out into the light. And now, as I share my story with you, I want to leave you with this question. If you were treated the way I was, what would you do? Would you endure, or would you draw a line? Tell me your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're listening from. Because stories like mine are not rare, but healing, courage, and freedom, they are possible. And sometimes they begin with something as simple as a blue cup and the silence it holds. If my story touched you, I invite you to join this community. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter. And more importantly, share your truth. Have you ever carried the weight of family expecting too much or felt unseen by the very people you sacrifice for? Tell me in the comments. Your voice matters here. Where are you listening from today? Let us know, because no matter where we come from, our stories connect us.